Hello and welcome. I am your AP World History teacher, Ben Osborne. Looking forward to finishing up Imperialism, our Unit 6 here. This one's a little shorter, called Consequences. It's just some of the kind of like long-term effects and things of imperialism that we're going to see, particularly related to things like migration and economics. So we'll kind of do that real quick, wrap it up, and we'll be done with all this. All right, let's check it out. First off, we're looking at some long-term consequences related to economics. Okay, so enormous numbers of new inventions led to more expansion and connections. Railroads, steamships, telegraphs are going to connect the world, and particularly the world of business. So that's going to tie it all together. Additionally, these new cash crops will become very important. We mentioned that before when we talked about various kind of things like rubber and stuff that they were trying to produce. They needed to something to keep the growing profitable. However, so like they're starting to run up against a problem that they don't have enough like manure and stuff like that to be able to get these crops to grow. So how do you handle that? Well, they find an example of something that they can use, which is known as guano. So guano is basically bird poop, is basically what it is. Birds go to these islands, they go to the bathroom all over them, and then that kind of dries up after a while. And it contains a lot of the things that you need to grow crops more successfully. So what happens is they find all these little islands, and they start to kind of like dig up all this guano in other places, and they start to use it as fertilizer. Okay, so cash crops will lead to export economies focused on growing and then exporting crops. One of the big problems here is it's going to lead to monocultures, which leads to a lack of agricultural diversity. They're not growing like 5 different kinds of wheat, they're growing one because that's the one that works the best. And so that is a big issue. When it comes to things like bananas, for example, with bananas, they were growing one varietal because it worked really well, and then there was a fungus that came along and killed them all. And so they had to bring another varietal out instead. So this lack of agricultural diversity sometimes can really damage them, but in the short run, at least, it is going to be very lucrative. In addition to cash crops, we got a lot of other kind of like minerals and stuff, ivory, diamonds, gold, all these kind of stuff become important as money-making exports as they do more mining. One of the things that's so up there on the top left is the cormorants. I think this is the example of what kind of guano is like. They land on these rocks on these little tiny islands. They go to the bathroom, and it kind of builds up over time into phosphates that they can use for guano. The problem, though, is that these things built up over thousands of years, and so the humans start digging them out, and it's really bad because they don't have a lot of it for quite a period of time. There's a point at which people really thought that we were going to have a huge crunch, and that a lot of people were going to die. But then we discovered new kind of chemicals, ability to create new chemicals and stuff, and that's going to solve that problem in the long run. One of the things about this cash crop kind of monoculture thing too is that it ends up creating these crazy countries, right? Like over here on the left, you can see this part of West Africa. Take a look particularly at Togo and Benin, right? Like those countries don't make any sense at all. They're just super narrow. Like what in the world's going on there? Well, what it is that whole country is an extractive colony. So Germany controlled Togo, and I think Britain controlled Benin. And so what they're basically doing here is they are creating a country that goes inward to wherever their resources they're getting. I don't know what the resources here were, but let's say that it's rubber, for example. And the interior then is where they're growing rubber, and the Germans just needed a way to get it to the coast. So they would create a rail line that would make that stuff go all the way to the coast. The problem, of course, is that this does not make like a normal country, right? Like there's nothing normal about that country. It's not like it's a group of people who have similarities or they want to work together or whatever. It's purely this economic kind of form that's designed to extract materials, which means, again, in the modern day, when we talk about Africa and some of the problems that it has, obviously we don't want to take away agency from Africans. People there are some of the people who are causing issues and problems. I mean, the dictators and all this kind of stuff, right? But they weren't set up very well to solve these problems. Like if your country is shaped like a stick because you need to get resources out, it does not make for good things in the long run. A good example of this is above me here with Nigeria. You can see it on the map over there as well. This country was just created at the Berlin Conference. It's a British country, but you can see the different kinds of groups here, right? This is principal linguistic groups of the country. You can see that there is an enormous amount of ethnic diversity here. So the Hausa, the Fulani, the Yoruba, the Igbo, I mean, all these different groups are here kind of crammed together in this country, and they don't necessarily have a lot of similarities to each other. Also, many of these ethnic groups spread over other countries. So like the Hausa and Fulani spread over into to the north into I think it's Niger, and so they're on both sides of this border, but yet they have similar ideas and stuff. It's very chaotic. That's not even to mention the issues of religion. Northern Nigeria is predominantly Muslim, whereas southern Nigeria is Christian and or traditional African religion. So these European imperialist groups just create these crazy countries that don't make any sense whatsoever. All right, continuing with economics. Economic imperialism was practiced around the world, Western powers taking advantage of local people. So, spheres of influence is an example of this. In particular, the United States was an important economic imperialist. We didn't tend to do a lot of direct control. I mean, Puerto Rico is kind of the exception to that, but we primarily dominated the economics of Latin America for our own benefits. So we invested heavily in Cuba and Mexico. In the Caribbean and Central America, the United States often intervened in order to protect governments friendly to us. So these were known as banana republics because we would dominate these areas to help keep our bananas growing. In Hawaii, the United States supported the overthrow of the native monarchy for economic reasons as well, because they wanted to take control of that region for like a coaling station and for cheap sugar, etc. This map's a little blurry, unfortunately, but it's a good one because it shows a lot of the places where the United States intervened in the Caribbean. It's a little bit beyond our time in the 1900s or 1900, but 1895 to 1930s, you can see all the different times that the United States intervened. So, for example, Cuba, we have an occupation for 4 years. What is that, 98 to 1902? Then we come back in 1908. We invade in 1912, 1917. We have this amendment in effect and all this kind of stuff. We were involved in Mexico, Nicaragua. We basically create Panama. The Virgin Islands is something we purchase. We have a boundary dispute that we help settle between Venezuela and Colombia. British Guiana. So we're just constantly going into these places and taking them over and telling them sort of what to do over the long term. So the United States is heavily involved here. We're not dominating them. We're not like controlling them. We're not like setting up governments, or we're not directly annexing them. But instead, what we're doing is we're kind of telling them what to do and maintaining the economic power that we have. One thing that's interesting here is for migration. So slavery, of course, ends in the 19th century, but there's still a desire for low-wage labor. So what do the imperial powers do then? They are going to start moving people around or incentivize movement for people to move around in order to take advantage of low wages. You're not able to have slaves anymore, but we could have, say, people from India who need jobs and need places to be. Indian laborers, for example, will move to South Africa, East Africa, and Fiji. Chinese move to the United States and Malaya. Japanese moved to Hawaii and Peru. Most of these people were what are known as contract laborers. They were supposed to kind of go home, basically, but many of them were just sort of tricked into signing onto these contracts, and they had a lot of unjust conditions, which prevented them from going anywhere or having any rights. Poor conditions also push people to move as well. So one big example here would be the Great Famine in Ireland. There was a potato blight. It killed like about 1 million people, and over 1 million people fled to places like the United States in order to survive. Like the population of Ireland still has not recovered from this. It's where a lot of Americans come from. My family came over during this time period in the 1840s or 50s. One part of my family, I don't know. We don't really know a lot about our family really, but one part of our family definitely did come over as a result of this potato blight. Here you can see an example of Irish immigrants coming to the United States. You can see there 1850, huge increase, 1845 to 1850. That's when our potato blight is going on. Every year we had over 200,000 people or whatever coming to America to try to take advantage. And then, of course, after that, it drops precipitously, especially during the Civil War. Then it kind of comes up a bit again a little bit later, but never as much as it was initially during that potato blight. All right, lastly, a couple of other examples. What's the impact of this migration in this period? A couple things that are kind of interesting. We got a spread of religions. So Hinduism in the Caribbean, for example. If you go to Trinidad and Tobago, there is widespread Hinduism in that area. Many locations where people immigrated from ended up also having a gender imbalance. So, for example, a lot of men will leave their homes, and that leads to women being in charge. And women having a lot more independence as a result of that scarcity of women in the new areas, or the scarcity of men in the older areas. In new places, people often formed ethnic enclaves. In America, we call these like Chinatowns, for example, the most famous one being in San Francisco. But there's also some in like Washington or New York. People of different, similar ethnicities want to live together. If you speak Chinese, it makes sense that you want to live near people who speak Chinese. But this ended up scaring the crap out of the Americans and led to the immigration restriction. This was known as the quote unquote, and yes, I realize it's a racist term, but for historical purposes, the Yellow Peril was what it was known as. So the United States, being extremely afraid of Chinese and Japanese immigration, passed a law called the Chinese Exclusion Act. It excluded anybody from China for years, like permanently, basically. And it said that any Chinese that lived in America America were not U.S. citizens. Now, that theoretically is unconstitutional because if you're born here, you're a citizen, but at least theoretically in that time period, they were not. That law is not lifted until 1943 or 42 during World War II because the United States was kind of embarrassed about being allies with China and then not allowing Chinese nationals into the United States. Indians will move to British outposts like Natal and Mauritius to work on sugar plantations. In Southeast Asia, we are going to have the system called the Kangani system, which was used to move entire families. The details of the system are kind of random, but like usually what happened was that you would have like a couple of men move from India to someplace else to do work or whatever, right? Theoretically, they're going to come home, but they didn't often do that. The Kangani system, on the other hand, was to sort of solve the issue of these men being sort of rootless or whatever. Instead, they would just take entire families or like villages or whatever and pick them up and move them to new locations. Again, they're signing contracts. They're not forced necessarily, but these contracts are pretty exploitative. All right, that's it. That's a short one, like I said. Appreciate y'all paying attention. Sorry for the cough there. Thanks a lot. I hope y'all maybe not enjoyed because it's kind of a depressing topic, but hopefully this was helpful to you when it comes to time to getting ready for that AP exam. Thanks a lot, guys. Appreciate it. Y'all take care.